Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
For nearly 2 decades, Benny Hill was the king of slapstick television. His absurd sketches, sped-up chase scenes, and cheeky innuendo had audiences laughing in 140 countries. But one night, one sketch, and one moment changed everything. It was a scene so controversial, so tone-deaf by modern standards, that ITV executives pulled the plug, quietly, permanently, and without a word to the public. But what exactly happened? And why was the Benny Hill Show really taken off the air after so many years of success? This isn't just a story about comedy gone too far. It's about how the world changed, and how Benny Hill never saw it coming. Long before cancel culture and viral backlash became part of the entertainment lexicon, there was Benny Hill. A wiry, grinning man with a boyish glint in his eye and a bottomless bag of slapstick tricks. He wasn't just a British comedian, he was an institution. At his peak, Benny Hill was one of the most watched entertainers in the world. His TV show, The Benny Hill Show, aired in over 140 countries, dubbed into dozens of languages, and pulled in audiences that modern streaming giants would envy. But before it all came crashing down, it was comedy gold, or at least, that's how it looked on the surface. The show debuted in 1955 and quickly established a formula that, for its time, was both familiar and revolutionary. Hill blended silent film-era physical comedy with a new kind of television spectacle, sped-up chase scenes, bawdy humor, innuendo-laden sketches, and a constant parade of scantily clad women who seemed to be both the punchline and the set decoration. It was lowbrow. It was high energy. It was unmistakably Benny Hill. But here's the thing most people forget: Benny Hill was a clever man. Behind the fast-paced antics and goofy sound effects was a performer who knew exactly what he was doing. He studied Chaplin, revered Laurel and Hardy, and often wrote dozens of sketches himself. Hill didn't just want to make people laugh, he wanted to make them laugh at the absurdity of society. Class divisions. Sexual repression. British taboos. His comedy poked fun at everyone, including himself. He was the fool who knew he was a fool. By the 1970s, the Benny Hill Show had become appointment television. When it moved to Thames Television in 1969, the production values increased, and so did the audience. The show's theme music, Yakety Sax, became iconic in its own right, instantly recognizable and forever tied to images of men being chased by women in nurses' outfits or policemen falling face-first into a pie. It was cartoonish, yes, but it worked. In a world where television was still rigid, Hill was loose. In a culture full of stiff upper lips, he made people spit out their tea with laughter. American audiences loved him too. In the 1980s, reruns of the show were broadcast late at night on U.S. stations, making Benny Hill an unlikely cult hero for a new generation. Teenage boys giggled at the cheeky humor, while older fans praised his timing and physical precision. By 1980, he was reportedly earning over £100,000 per episode, a staggering figure for the time. But beneath the laughter, the cracks had already begun to show. Hill was never particularly interested in adapting or updating the show's tone. He had found a formula that worked, and he stuck with it, even as the world moved on. Feminism was rising. Political correctness was gaining traction. And comedy was beginning to shift from broad slapstick to sharp, character-driven satire. Hill's humor, once cheeky and harmless, was starting to feel dated, and, to some, offensive. Behind the scenes, tensions grew. Younger writers and producers wanted to move the show in a more modern direction. Benny resisted. He didn't understand what was changing, or why the same jokes that had once made people roar with laughter were now making them uncomfortable. For him, it was all in good fun. The chase scenes, the bum slapping, the leering. It was pantomime, not politics. But audiences were beginning to murmur. Letters started trickling in. Critics sharpened their knives. Sketches that had once drawn applause now drew silence. And somewhere inside the Thames television boardroom, executives began to ask the question no one had dared ask before: had the Benny Hill show finally run its course? No one knew it at the time, but the end was near. A single scene, one not yet aired, would serve as the tipping point. The moment that pushed the show from outdated to unacceptable. And when it finally hit the airwaves, it wouldn't just offend, it would shut everything down. But before that scene ever aired, the Benny Hill show had already become a relic of its time. A monument to a kind of comedy that couldn't outrun the changing world forever. Benny Hill had sprinted through decades of fame, but the chase was almost over. By the mid-1980s, the world was changing. And while the Benny Hill show remained a ratings juggernaut, the culture that had once embraced its cheeky, slapstick formula was shifting beneath Benny Hill's feet, and he didn't know how to catch up. What was once seen as light-hearted and silly now began to look like something else entirely. Crude. Sexist. Even predatory. And for the first time, people weren't laughing. Hill himself was a complicated man. In private, he was shy, reclusive, and often melancholic. But on screen, he played a very different role, the perpetual pursuer, of women, of gags, of chaos. Every sketch was built around a simple premise: the chase. He chased women, police chased him, and the audience chased the punchline. The women, mostly young and scantily dressed, were often the butt of the joke, or the bait. For decades, viewers accepted it. Some even adored it. But by the time the late 80s rolled around, the climate had changed, and what had once seemed harmless now raised deeper questions. Feminist movements across the UK and America had entered the mainstream. People began to openly question how women were portrayed on screen, not just in serious dramas, but in comedy too. And suddenly, the Benny Hill show felt like a relic from another world. A world where women were either nagging wives, dizzy blondes, or objects of lust. A world where their value existed in how fast they could run in high heels, how tight their costumes were, or how wide they could slap a man across the face before the scene ended with a wink. Newer comedians were rising: French and Saunders, Rowan Atkinson, Ricky Gervais, and American imports like Saturday Night Live, all pushing boundaries in ways that felt smarter, sharper, and more self-aware. Hill's style, which had once felt timeless, now felt trapped in time. But Benny wasn't ready to change. "If it ain't broke, don't fix it," he famously told a producer in 1987 when questioned about the repetitiveness of his sketches. He didn't understand why the same jokes that had built his empire were now considered offensive. In his mind, they were playful, not malicious. He genuinely believed that comedy should be universal, something that transcended politics and cultural shifts. What he didn't realize was that the world had grown more aware, and less tolerant of the old rules. ITV executives began to feel the pressure. Critics accused the network of propping up outdated, misogynistic content. Viewers wrote in with complaints. The show's once loyal advertisers started to voice discomfort. Internally, there were hushed conversations. Could they continue backing a show that was now seen as regressive? Should they try to modernize Benny's format, or quietly let it die? Hill resisted every attempt at change. He refused to hire female writers. He declined ideas to update his characters or tone down the sexuality. To him, the backlash was overblown, a small, angry group trying to ruin everyone's fun. But what Benny didn't understand was that this wasn't just about him. It was about the bigger conversation around comedy, consent, and representation. What once passed as harmless was now being interrogated under a sharper, less forgiving lens. Then came the incident. The scene. It wasn't more outrageous than anything Hill had done before, at least not on the surface. But something about it struck a nerve. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the cultural atmosphere. Maybe it was the fact that this time, the audience didn't laugh. They cringed. The network, already nervous, was forced to make a decision. One sketch. One scene. That was all it took to bring decades of television history to a grinding halt. But before that moment aired, the writing was already on the wall. Hill's world, one built on playful chaos and wild chases, was about to collide with a culture that no longer found it funny. The scene wasn't just a punchline gone wrong. It was a mirror, reflecting the uncomfortable truth that sometimes, comedy doesn't age. Sometimes, it just gets old. The sketch in question, aired in 1989, buried innocently within the usual slapstick montage of the Benny Hill Show. On the surface, it looked like any other segment Benny had done hundreds of times before, a simple setup, a mischievous grin, and a chase that ended in embarrassment for someone. But this time, something was different. The laughter didn't come. Not from the audience. Not from the critics. Not from the network boardroom. This scene wasn't just poorly timed. It was deeply out of step with the moment. And within hours of its airing, it was clear, the Benny Hill Show had finally gone too far. The sketch opened with Benny playing an elderly lecherous professor giving a lecture to a group of young women. Every word he uttered was laced with double entendre, a typical Hill trope. But what followed wasn't typical. The camera repeatedly cut to close-ups of the women's bodies, lingering, objectifying, reducing them to props in a way that even Benny's previous sketches had mostly avoided. There was a cruel undertone to the humor, less playful, more predatory. The female characters were stripped of agency entirely. They didn't even get to slap him back this time. They simply looked confused. Powerless. Then came the moment. Toward the end of the sketch, one of the young women tried to leave the room. Benny's character followed, cornered her, and delivered a line, meant to be a punchline, that hit like a brick. "Class dismissed, but you're staying behind." He leered. The audience tittered. The woman's expression turned blank. The scene cut to a typical chase, Benny running, women following. But the damage had already been done. For some, it seemed like more of the same. But for many, including several ITV executives, it crossed a line. It wasn't just dated. It was disturbing. The imagery, the tone, the implications, all felt wrong. Not just out of place in a changing era, but out of touch with basic human decency. The network received complaints almost immediately. Viewers, especially women, wrote letters condemning the scene as inappropriate and offensive. Critics lambasted it. Newspapers published headlines like "Benny Hill's Final Misstep" and "Time's Up for the King of Crude." Inside Thames Television, the reaction was swift, and uncharacteristically silent. There were no warnings issued. No public apologies. Just a decision, made quietly behind closed doors: the next season would not be commissioned. The Benny Hill Show, after nearly 35 years on the air, was done. No farewell special. No on-air announcement. Just a quiet cancellation buried beneath press statements about creative directions and changing tastes. Benny was devastated. He didn't understand what had happened. To him, the sketch was no worse than what had come before. But that was exactly the problem: he hadn't changed, and the world had. Comedy was no longer just about timing. It was about responsibility. And while Benny had mastered the former, he had never quite grasped the latter. Friends say that after the show was cancelled, Benny withdrew. He still received royalty checks, still had his name in lights overseas, but something in him broke. He continued writing sketches, hundreds of them, in notebooks that were never filmed. He lived alone in a small rented flat, a millionaire with a microwave dinner. No wife. No children. No final comeback. He often told friends, "I never got the chance to say goodbye." And he didn't. Not to the audience. Not to his critics. Not to the world that had once adored him. The scene, that one scene, may not have been more outrageous than what came before. But it was a moment frozen in time. A line that separated what was from what could no longer be. It wasn't the worst thing Benny Hill ever did. But it was the last. And in the end, that's how legends fall, not with scandal, not with outrage, but with a joke that no one laughs at anymore. When the Benny Hill Show was finally taken off the air, there was no funeral for it. No final curtain call. No public tribute. It simply vanished from the schedule like a forgotten act, a relic pushed aside by a world that no longer had room for its brand of comedy. Benny Hill had gone from being the most recognizable face in British television to a man suddenly out of place, and out of time. But while the cameras stopped rolling, the man himself kept living, quietly, painfully, and ultimately, tragically. In the immediate aftermath, Benny's public appearances dwindled. He no longer had reason to visit the studios. The production offices were closed. The costume racks, with his countless disguises and cheap wigs, were packed away, never to be used again. For the first time in decades, Benny Hill was unemployed. But worse than that, he was unwanted. The press, once obsessed with covering his antics, now seemed to mock him. Headlines that once praised him now ridiculed his fall from grace. "The laugh track goes silent," one paper wrote. Others were crueler. Old, out of touch, and no longer funny. The world he had entertained for nearly 40 years was moving on, and it wasn't looking back. Privately, Benny felt the sting. Friends and former colleagues say he didn't lash out, that wasn't his style. Instead, he withdrew. He rented a modest flat in Teddington, not far from the Thames television studios that once buzzed with his energy. But now, the days were long and empty. He rarely left the flat. He watched old reruns of silent film stars, his idols, and jotted down sketch ideas in spiral notebooks, as if hoping one day, the door would knock and someone would ask him to come back. But no one did. What many fans didn't realize was how lonely Benny Hill truly was. Despite decades of fame, he never married. He had no children. The women on his show were often seen as companions, but none were romantic partners. He had proposed a few times in his younger years, but always got cold feet. Fame, he once admitted, made relationships hard. And when the fame disappeared, so did the chances at love. His health began to decline in the early 1990s. Benny suffered from heart problems, and years of neglecting doctor visits caught up with him. He was told he needed bypass surgery. He delayed it. He insisted he was fine. But everyone around him saw the truth. Benny Hill, the man who once sprinted across screens in a blur of comedy chaos, could barely climb his stairs. On April 20, 1992, Benny Hill was found dead in his flat, sitting in his armchair, surrounded by silence. The television was still on. A notebook filled with a news joke sat beside him. He had died alone, of coronary thrombosis, possibly days before anyone noticed. The news sent a wave of sadness across the UK, and even the world. Comedians who had once criticized his humor now paid tribute to his legacy. "He made millions laugh," said one colleague. "And that's more than most of us ever will." For a brief moment, Benny Hill was remembered not as the man who went too far, but as the man who once made the world laugh, genuinely, loudly, and without apology. In the years since his death, public opinion has slowly softened. Reruns of The Benny Hill Show still air in certain countries, and many viewers look back on his work not with offense, but nostalgia. His sketches are now studied as part of comedy history, as a reflection of the era they came from and the boundaries they once pushed. But the truth remains, one scene was all it took to bring it crashing down. One moment that captured how far the culture had shifted, and how quickly the ground could vanish beneath a performer's feet. Benny Hill didn't survive the fall. But he never begged for a hand back up. He died believing he had done what he was born to do, make people laugh. Even if, in the end, no one was laughing anymore.